Hello everyone, welcome to What the Tax, a UNDP podcast series organized as part of the Taxfair SDGs initiative. I'm Hakshala David, your host, and I'm so excited to welcome you all back to the fourth episode. I know we've had a little bit of a break since the third one, and I'm excited that we're recording this along the margins of the National Tax Dialogue, which is also happening around the same time. This is going to be the country's first ever tax dialogue where we hope to bring together key different stakeholders such as the tax policymakers, the tax collectors, the taxpayers themselves into the same conversation to unpack different themes that are central to taxation. And one such theme that is central, where we will be talking in detail about today, is digital transformation and taxation. And for that, I'm so excited to be speaking to Lauren Kahn. She's the Director of Research and Strategy at the Digital Public UK. Lauren is actually a digital leader, a thought leader, in fact, with decades of international experience in digital transformation and a strong advocate of sustainable digital transformation as well. So I'm excited to speak to her, get her views about digital transformation, mostly pertaining to taxation. And on that note, hi Lauren, welcome to the UNDP podcast series, and I'm so excited to have you here with us. Thank you so much for doing this. I know that digital transformation is of course talked about in the global forum in many different contexts, right? Taxation is no exception to it. But in terms of taxation, I'm really excited to hear your views today in terms of the different themes that are attached to it, be it from the point of view of how governance mechanisms or government policies play a role, how attitude shifts play a role, how building the trust and how it could be viewed as an enabler of anti-corruption. There are so many different aspects to digital transformation in taxation. But my first question to you, perhaps a simple one, but maybe a loaded one. Why even talk about digitalization or digital transformation in taxation? How would you think of it in the most practical sense?
Hi, Hakshala. So lovely to be here today. It's a real privilege to be joining What the Tax to talk to you about digitalization. And a really great first question, why transform tax digitally? And I think there are a number of big forces at play that are really shifting governments to look in this direction. I think the first obvious shift is we're seeing all sorts of new technologies and new business models coming along. And governments have to think differently, both about how they deliver and administrate tax to people, but also how those changes in business models are actually going to impact on their tax system. So that's one of the push factors. I think the second big one is citizens are changing. All of you who are watching today have increasingly high expectations on government services, that they should be as seamless and as easy to use as any of the digital services that you use in your daily life for your entertainment and your leisure. Public services should be the same, and governments are really being pushed in that direction by people. And then finally, I think the other big push on governments is there is an enormous global economic disruption and crisis right now. Countries are really under pressure and they need to innovate and find ways to raise more tax and do this in a way that is actually bringing citizens along in the process. And I think that's the push side of the equation, but there's also a big pull side for governments, lots of benefits to doing this kind of transformation. The first one is that citizens can have a far greater experience in terms of how they do their taxes. It can be simple, it can be easy to use. For governments themselves, it becomes much more easy and efficient to administer taxes. You can more easily pick up fraud in the system and you lose less money in the process. And then finally, I think it's really interesting that when people build trust in digital public services, they also start building their trust in the wider digital economy. And you can see all sorts of potential for economic growth and inclusion for a country if you can get people to start really trusting digital services, particularly in the financial space. And there are all sorts of opportunities to include people like women, like young people, and groups who might otherwise not be brought along in these transformations.
Absolutely. It was interesting that you shared about the push and the pull factors, where you talked about the benefits in the pull factors, right? Where reaping the benefits is important and it benefits a wide range of stakeholders. My follow-up question to that is, if we were to attain it, if we were to reap those benefits, what kind of infrastructure requirements would that digital transformation require? Be it from the hard infrastructure and the soft infrastructure, where you look at digital public infrastructure as a whole, as an entirety. What are your thoughts on that?
That's a really great question, and I think I'd probably answer your question at two levels. Firstly, in order for a government to really transform its tax digitally, they need to not just be focusing on digital tax, they need to be taking a whole of government approach to digital transformation of service delivery more broadly. And that's a much bigger project than just narrowly focusing on making what was once an analog tax process into a digital channel. The key vision for going digital as a government is really about the opportunity to join up all of your services, to give citizens a really seamless experience, whether you're interfacing about tax or your education or your health. So it's really important that governments take that bigger picture perspective. And in order to do that, it requires investing, as you've rightly said, in digital public infrastructure. Now, digital public infrastructure is a way that you create foundations for all sorts of services to be built upon. And some of the key public infrastructures that are needed in this digital space are digital identity. So can citizens prove who they are in order to do a tax transaction or interface with government more generally? It requires investments in a digital payments system. So can you prove who you are, and can you then be able to pay? And then very finally, it also requires investing in a data layer, an exchange of data, because you need to be able to move citizens' data around in order to be able to service their needs. So really investing in those fundamental building blocks of digital are quite important, both for this tax system to build upon, but for all of government digital service delivery. The next level that governments have to get right is not just looking whole of government, but actually thinking whole of society, because getting the government digital service delivery piece is only one part of the equation. You also need to be looking at people, your citizens. Do they have the digital literacy and the skills? Do they trust in your system? How are you going to be building those sorts of skill sets in order to enable this? Then looking at things like regulation. Do you have regulation in place that ensures that citizens' data is going to be stored securely in your tax system? Do you have privacy in mind? So that's really important. Then you've got a piece that's also about the business stakeholders. So governments don't just administer tax in a vacuum. They work with all sorts of businesses like banks. They can access banking data in order to be able to get a better understanding of citizens. So being able to engage all of those different groupings is important. And then very finally and fundamentally, there's physical hard infrastructure that needs to be in place. You can't have a digital government or a digital tax system if you don't have the basics of internet connectivity and infrastructure in place. So focusing on all of those fundamentals in the wider picture is really important to help governments move their tax systems into the digital era.
In terms of what you said about the whole of government approach, when you talked about privacy, in Sri Lanka, for example, we have the Personal Data Protection Act, and a national AI strategy is also in the works, which UNDP is supporting with as well. So there are these different elements as part of the policy point of view, which are already moving in that direction. And from a tax point of view, we also have the digitalization of the tax collection system as well. I understand when you say that a whole of government approach is important, but practically, when different pieces are moved where it does not necessarily follow a linear approach, it may be linear on paper, but in practice, it may be quite not talking to each other. What kind of challenges does it pose? Have you seen any case studies or best practices where convergence of those policies have been done in a certain way where it helps a country to attain that overall objective more effectively?
Very good question, and I think I completely agree with your observation that what I've just set out sounds like a very clear set of things that governments can work through in a linear way and get to a beautiful tax system at the end. Unfortunately, in practice, it's far more complex than that. I think I'd say that many countries are experimenting with new approaches to tax, but there isn't one size fits all solution to all of this. I think there are probably 4 different dimensions that I talk about that governments are really leaning into, and different examples can be used for different governments around the world across all of these. So I think the first piece is around becoming much more taxpayer-centric. So how do you shift away from it all being about the tax system and rather be a system in service of people? I think one of the first areas that governments are really focusing in on is around shifting from a very tax system-oriented approach to a taxpayer-centric approach. And this means working in a much more user-centric way. And this is quite a new skill set for government who haven't necessarily had experiences of really designing around citizens' needs. And I think some of the governments who are doing really well in the digitization of tax are really putting citizens' needs at the center. A great example of this from Rwanda that I was looking at recently. I think our temptation might be in government to jump to the latest technology in terms of bringing tax into the digital era. But in Rwanda, they actually did user research that told them actually in rural areas, there wasn't enough connectivity to do anything too complex in terms of technology. And they came up with a really simple solution that was able to be used by citizens on a basic feature phone. They'd still be able to actually access the tax system, and micro taxpayers would be able to pay that way. So I think that's a really nice example of citizen centricity and how governments are getting there. I think the second dimension that governments are looking at is around technologies, particularly digital systems and data. I think a couple of great examples of that, firstly, thinking about Ethiopia. They've just done a really innovative aspect of their tax system by connecting up the tax system with a new digital identity system that they've just brought in. And that's a great example of digital public infrastructure coming in and really enabling the tax system. So they now don't have to collect and verify the identities of taxpayers because that's already been done for them in their digital identity system. So it saves money for the government, but more importantly for citizens, it means you tell once who you are rather than multiple different government departments. Another great example is in Australia, the use of AI. They are really deploying AI innovatively to pre-populate people and businesses' tax returns for them. They're also using AI to assess whether someone might have made a mistake on their tax return based on the previous returns that they've made. And they're also using AI to bring in data from banks and elsewhere to really pull together and make life a lot easier for taxpayers. And then the final dimension where governments are really having to experiment is really around governance. So how do you actually make a system that is transparent and accountable, but do it in a way that's fit for purpose in a digital era? And I think we've seen a lot of governments around the world getting things wrong when it comes to algorithms, where terrible mistakes have been made and they've had to come in and make apologies. I think what we're starting to see is people experimenting with what does AI accountability look like, or AI era accountability and transparency look like. In the UK, we have just published an algorithmic transparency standard, which is guiding all public sector organizations who are using AI how to be transparent about where they're using it and how to publish that in a way that citizens can understand. An ordinary person can understand how is an algorithm involved in deciding something that's really important about my future. One other, I think, really exciting example is something called rules as code. So the tax rules in the past would have been written in long, heavy documents, and it's obviously very difficult for citizens to know all of their rights, but all of their obligations in a tax system. And rules as code, which is being used in a few countries around the world, New Zealand and France, to name a few, people are actually coming in and taking legislation and turning it into machine-readable code so that any citizen can say, I'm so-and-so, I'm in this situation, and the computer will basically tell them how much tax are you obliged to pay or how many benefits are you entitled to receive. It's a very powerful way of citizens being empowered. So those are a couple of the areas where governments are really making great strides around citizen centricity, around technologies and data and governance. The final piece I think that's really important is around government capability in this space and being able to invest in their own capability to really continuously innovate in the context of tax. And Singapore has really set up an amazing public sector innovation agency that is teaching government departments across different public services and including tax, really building the capability of civil servants to be able to innovate and keep in touch with citizens' needs and feed that into how they're administering a tax system. And I think that's a really powerful example and an important one as well, to remember that civil servants themselves also need to be brought on this journey and empowered and capacitated.
Of course. Wow, that's quite impressive because you covered a lot of different segments, including a lot of different users as well. I'm quite curious to ask you something about AI, but before I do that, you talked about the approach towards a next generation of citizens, right? The future of what the citizenry would look like. So in that regard, having a shift in behavior and in attitudes also plays a role, right? In that case, what kind of behavioral shifts do you think are important to make this transformation a reality from the different users' perspective that you just explained earlier?
That's another great question. I think one of the biggest shifts that I've observed is that governments are trying to actually reset a relationship with citizens when it comes to tax. I think in the past, governments really took quite a top-down, coercive approach to push citizens into paying their taxes and into compliance. And now they're really trying to shift to a different type of model. It's around cooperation and co-creation and working together as one system. And I think the reason for that shift is that governments have seen a crisis of confidence in them around their tax system from citizens. And they've realized they really need to be rebuilding trust with people. So I think that's one important shift, and that's a relationship shift that's coming from government. I think in turn, that shift is attempting to also then drive a new social contract and a new set of behaviors from citizens at the same time. It's about empowering people to step up and take responsibility for their taxes, but doing it in a way that's far more simple and intuitive and easy to do. I think governments are also looking at ways that technology can play a more powerful role in prompting people to do the right thing. And the example that I've given around the use of AI in Australia, I think is a great demonstrator of that. They are really deploying all of citizens' data from multiple sources within government and the wider ecosystem within banks in a way that's helping people to do the right thing when it comes to tax, rather than telling people, you're in trouble, you need to pay your taxes right now. So it's shifting from quite an authoritarian approach to a collaborative approach, which I think is really interesting. And the other sort of wider piece is governments are really starting to think about the role of the wider ecosystem. So you've got your governments, you've got your taxpayers, you've got consultants, you've got legislators, you've got administrators. How do you actually align all of those different actors together to get the right outcome in terms of tax payments? So it's a much more stakeholder-focused and people-led approach to tax than in the past, when it was simply an administrator sitting in a relatively siloed way running a process.
Got it, yeah. And the example that you gave earlier, the one from Rwanda, it's also a good example of how this can be an enabler of inclusivity as well, right? Bringing all the relevant stakeholders within the same forum. That digital does have the power to do that in the broader context of taxation as well.
I completely agree. And I think that there's been a real focus on accessibility and inclusivity as part of this citizen-centric shift of governments. Getting that piece right and making it easy for people to access government services and do the right thing, I think is a real starting point for all of this. And that's where my message that governments shouldn't get overly excited by the shiniest, newest technology or solutions. It should be about finding the thing that works best for citizens, and it needs to work for the people who are the most likely to be excluded or left behind. It needs to work for them first, and then it will work for everyone else. And that is what we call accessible by design in digital.
Absolutely. Related to that, but also going back to the previous point you made about AI, I saw recently that in the UK, with the support of academia, there was a publication that was done on the human and AI-based decision making, but in the context of national security, where they had analyzed factors such as how self-confidence plays a role in decision making. Referring to what you said about AI, what kind of insights can you transfer from an AI-based analysis such as that in the context of taxation, for example?
Really interesting question. And the study you refer to is great. It was carried out by the Alan Turing Institute in the UK, who are based at Cambridge University. And they found something really interesting, which was that they were looking at national security staff. And when those people were getting AI-generated outputs that were about a particular event that had happened, they would have a high level of confidence that the AI-generated output was trustworthy and reliable. However, when they got content from, or an output from AI that was about inferring a causal relationship between one event and another, people tended to have less confidence in the AI output. And actually, what those researchers find is that those people were quite right in only trusting AI so far. I think what we need to remember is that many of the AI tools and sort of solutions out there are trained on the open internet or trained on data sources that might not be fully complete. And you need to know what is the underlying data behind these solutions, and to what extent can I trust that this will reliably give me the right answer each and every time I put a question to it. So I think being able to empower staff who are using these AI solutions to really tune in and use AI in a way that's complementary to human intelligence, rather than letting AI or artificial intelligence give all the answers to us, is really important. So I like to say the right equation is human intelligence plus artificial intelligence if you want to get a successful augmented output at the end of the day. It does require that governments, I think, also think very hard about the basics of data. What is the data clean? Is it representative? Is there bias in the data that we're using to make decisions? Algorithmic bias is a huge problem, and some data sets might not represent all of society, and therefore it means that there's certain portions of society who won't actually be correctly represented when artificial intelligence makes a decision. It's really important that civil servants who are involved in these processes are aware of these limitations and factor that into the way that they use AI in tax. Otherwise, you have a scenario that actually the people who are most vulnerable and potentially most in need of support from the state might actually not be represented in your decision making, or might be disadvantaged and doubly disadvantaged at that.
Of course. If we take a slight shift from the behavior and the insights and the role of AI that we've talked a bit about now, what are your views in terms of how digital plays a role in terms of corruption or anti-corruption in the broader context of taxation, for example, where tax evasion, illicit financial flows, tax havens, they all play a central role to the government's capabilities and capacities in terms of revenue mobilization, right? So how do you see digital playing a role with regards to corruption in taxation?
I think there is some enormous potential of digital in the context of anti-corruption, particularly when it comes to the tax space. I think one of the first areas that digital offers is the ability to cut out the middleman in equations, usually, or the human interaction, I think, that really carries out when a tax transaction is being made. When two humans are undergoing that transaction, there's always room for corruption to come into play. But when digital is in the middle of that, it actually reduces the opportunity for corruption to happen. And I think a really interesting recent example of this in action was in India, where they actually, for tax audits, started using algorithms to automatically assign auditors with particular taxpayers. So there wasn't room for collusion to happen between those two parties anymore. And that's quite a powerful way you can use AI to, at scale, make quite a difference in a system. The other ways that I think digital can also counter and sort of be a source of anti-corruption is that it creates greater transparency in the system. So it's easier to see, particularly with big data and analytics and AI at play, you can start to identify patterns that might give you an indication that fraudulent or illegal practices are at play. And then finally, I think it also creates transparency in that there's a digital report of these practices. There's more likely you'll actually be able to prosecute when this sort of activity is uncovered. So I think all of those practices coming together are quite a powerful tool against corruption in the system. But I think I'd also say that digital is not a silver bullet in terms of tackling corruption. And all of the things that I've said earlier in this podcast really come to the fore. The evidence is still out that when digital alone is put in place, if you haven't put a whole of government, a framework around things, if you haven't put a whole of society approach in place, you don't move all of the right actors together in a way that's really laddering towards good outcomes in your tax system. So focusing on digital in isolation isn't enough. And in particular, I think if you're trying to build an outcome that is about trust between citizens and a public institution, it is really about building that sense of cooperation around the tax system.
Absolutely. How it would enable to build that trust that is required, right, through transparency. In terms of how we see digital playing a role as an enabler, but also what happens is it disrupts the current ecosystem that's already at play, right? Be it the political economy or the existing mechanism, whether it's working well or not, it does disrupt an existing ecosystem where there may be a certain nuanced view that, okay, it may not be necessarily viewed as an enabler, but also as a disruptor. So from that point of view, what kind of challenges do you see in order to mitigate issues such as that? What kind of examples can you give from the global best practices where this balance can be struck between the different interest groups to make sure that it's done in a very comprehensive way with the support of all the stakeholders?
I think zooming out, the big answer to your question is about a strategy that is about stakeholder engagement and bringing those different stakeholder groups who are in different parts of your tax ecosystem along on the journey and taking a really co-creative approach. And despite digital sounding like it's all about technology, it's actually about how do you engage differently with people. And for governments, it means how do you build a different type of relationship with those people. So in order for governments to ensure that disruption is viewed positively, it's really important to get that process right. Sort of zooming inside government, there's also a massive process of disruption that happens when it comes to transforming a tax system or, in fact, any service delivery or part of government. The work that our organization does is to support governments around the world on their digital transformation journeys. And sometimes it can be really, really difficult to take that first step. Everything feels new. It can feel a bit uncomfortable taking on these new approaches where you have to be out there and engaging a lot more with citizens. You have to be collaborating across departments in a way that you didn't experience before. You have to be working with people who don't have traditional civil service skill sets like designers and coders, in the digital space, or user researchers. So there can be a lot of anxiety around that. And one of the most important things that we do when we partner with governments around the world is to say, start small and bold. Choose one small element of your tax system and let's bring together a new multidisciplinary team and a leader behind this. And let's test and learn this new approach in action. And it's a really powerful way to coach people along in this digital journey to experience and try new ways of working and new ways of engaging citizens. And it also creates a demonstrator service that everyone can see the value of, and by seeing the value of what you've done, it creates more momentum behind the new approach, and you get more ministers, and you get your senior leaders, and you get other civil servants on board, and everything spirals and grows in momentum from there. So it's that starting small, picking one real thing that can also make a real difference for citizens as your starting point is the best way to get started. And we've just done this, for example, working with the Ethiopian Ministry of Revenues, who are on this digital journey themselves.
Interesting. I think you brought us to a close on a very punchy note, which is start small but in a bold way. That's amazing to hear. Before we wrap up, any last thoughts that you want to leave with the audience?
I think my final thought is, firstly, that it's a huge privilege to be in Sri Lanka, especially during such an important week with the national dialogue around tax and the SDGs. And I think my final thought would just be that when you're thinking around digital and innovation, make sure that you're always innovating with a purpose, that you're laddering into big outcomes. And I think the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, need to be front of mind when we're thinking, how do we actually harness the power of digital technology in a way that's people-centric and really makes life better?
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much once again for doing this podcast with us. It was a pleasure having you, and hopefully we'll have you again with us sometime soon.
Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure to be here today.
On that note, we wrap up today's podcast. Hopefully, we'll see you back again on the next episode. This is Hakshala, your host, signing off. Thank you for watching and see you soon.